Thank you. Well, we talked a little bit about what to do beforehand, so I think I would start maybe by giving an overview of the immigration situation from my perspective. I work at the Times, as I said, that I cover immigration, veterans issues, also in New York City. I came in with Mayor de Blasio, covering the de Blasio administration. So I've got kind of a large kind of plate of things to cover. But for our purposes, let's talk about immigration. And I don't know if you've read a piece I did today about Obama and immigration, but in a word, the situation is bad. It's pretty bad as far as our hopes of immigration reform, at least at the federal level. So I've been covering this issue for the Times editorial page since about 2005, which is probably about when things went off the rails. So I haven't really met my goal of actually coming up with good, positive, humane immigration reform, although I've tried my best. But basically what we've ended up with after about 10 years now is a complete stalemate and kind of a defeat by immigration reform advocates to get a bill through Congress. The idea is that since the last big generational reform of immigration in the 80s, there's been an increase in the undocumented population. There are about 11.5 million people living here in the country without papers, living outside the law, and the system itself is broken. There aren't enough visas. There aren't enough ways for people to legalize. States are going haywire in some cases in enforcement. The quality of the debate has deteriorated. We've gone from a situation where the first President Bush and Ronald Reagan could talk about the need for kind of compassionate, humane responses to deal with immigration. They could use the word amnesty openly without shame or regret and talk about the need to welcome and embrace people who bring a lot to our country and our economy. But we're not there at the federal level. Things got worse this summer when a sudden, almost inexplicable surge of young people came to the Texas border. That was kind of mischaracterized by a lot of anti-immigrant folks as somehow testing a surge of illegal immigration, when in fact it was people who were coming to the Rio Grande in South Texas and turning themselves over to the Border Patrol in what looked more like a case of a humanitarian exodus of people leaving extreme violence in Central America, basically Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. But what that ended up doing is kind of queering the deal for whatever hopes there were for a political solution at the federal level. And now advocates who are looking for change are kind of stuck. There's no hope of a bill. They had been hoping that President Obama, having looked at the situation and explained himself to the public, would do something on his own, not to fix the problem, because he can't legalize anybody or give out citizenship or visas, but he could at least do what he's done for a small subset of the population, which is enact a policy to protect people from deportation and at least allow them to come out and get jobs. So, I'm sorry. Here I am, talking and not being heard. I apologize. But I won't go back over what I said. Basically, we're in bad straits. And a lot of folks have been counting on President Obama to fix the problem, at least temporarily, which he had promised to do, but he's announced that he's not going to do that, maybe not till after the election, or maybe not at all. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a desire to look at states and localities for solutions. Where the immigration debate has fallen down at the federal level is this effort at some grand solution, this big enchilada, as Senator Kennedy used to call it, that would fix the problem once and for all for a very large population. But for whatever reason, that's not going to go through with this Congress and this president. So you have to look at states and localities to do things. And what I've noticed is that when you deal with this problem as an abstract problem, and we deal with this population as a faceless population of 11.5 million, you get caught up in rhetoric about the danger they pose to our society and how illegal they are and how you can't grant amnesty to illegals. But when the problem is made concrete and when the people we're talking about become individuals, it becomes much less harder to sustain that rhetoric. And what little hope we've had for a solution on immigration has come in the form of relief for the folks we call dreamers, the children who were brought here illegally by their parents, who are Americans in all but name, who took it on themselves to advocate, to pressure Congress and the president to do something, and they actually won something. It's the one victory you can point to in this whole debate, where they got DACA, this Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is shielding them temporarily anyway from deportation and allowing them to work legally and granting a lot of hope for people. So it's an example of how when the faceless immigrant mass becomes real, when you have actual real people like Gabby Pacheco or Lorella Praeli, who are these activists who are lobbying people and saying, would you dare to deport me? They blanch and people stop, and they ended up not being able to do that. So states and localities, we found, have been the places where the progressive, humane, rational, bipartisan solutions have been found. So that's the one encouraging point, and this is why I'd like to turn it over to Nisha, because this is an example of where you can find hope, at least at the city level, with things being done to include people and to assimilate them and to welcome them into society. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the job that you do to make New York a more welcoming place for such a large percentage of its population.
Sure. So thank you, Lawrence, and thank you to the Tenement Museum for having me here tonight and for this big crowd. So for those of you who don't know, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs is basically the bridge between City Hall and New York City's immigrant communities. And as was mentioned, more than 1 out of 3 New Yorkers are immigrants or foreign-born. When you add the children of those immigrants, it's 60% of New York City. So this is not some sort of niche community. We are, immigrants are everywhere. And the sheer number of immigrants alone is bigger than the whole city of Chicago. So, we are a city of immigrants, and it's wonderful. I think I have the best job in New York, because basically what I do is help advise on policy and programs that the mission of the office is really to promote the well-being of immigrant communities. So how are we thinking about doing that? I think about our work kind of in a few broad categories. One is, Moya, my agency, is relatively small compared to most city agencies, right? HRA, the Human Resources Administration, has 14,000 people. We're not that big, but what we can do is be able to really embed notions of immigrant inclusion in our sister agencies and be able to really kind of permeate this notion that immigrants are part of New York City's fabric and that we can remove barriers to accessing the city. And so that's really kind of one major category of work that we're doing. A concrete example of that is one that you may have heard of, which is the new municipal ID card program, which the mayor announced support for in the State of the City address in January, and it's been a major part of his platform. And the idea here would be to create a city identification card that's available to all, regardless of immigration status, because right now in New York State, if you are undocumented, you cannot get a state driver's license, and many people are not able to do basic things like enter a building to go to a job interview because they don't have photo ID. So the idea here would be to create that kind of city ID and make it an ID card that's not just for undocumented immigrants, but is really a card that all New Yorkers will want, and we're going to pack it full of all sorts of exciting incentives and benefits for those of you who do have driver's licenses but love to go to places like the Tenement Museum and may get, sort of benefits and perks associated with being a municipal ID card member and just showing your membership in New York City. So that's one example of the type of thing that we're working on. We're also, another major area of work and a passion of mine, partly based on the work I'd done before, is around access to justice for immigrant communities. So if you take the example of the unaccompanied minors, estimates say that these children, and it's a relatively small percentage of the undocumented folks that are in New York City as a whole, between 40 to 60% of them have a claim to legal relief to stay in the country based on current law. So now imagine if you sort of extrapolate that to the broader population, it's transformative to go from being undocumented to potentially having legal status or some sort of stability in your life based on immigration status in terms of access to jobs, in terms of access to school loans, I mean, you name it, health benefits. So many of the things that lift people out of poverty and keep people out of poverty are currently barred for undocumented people. But if we're able to avail them of the right legal supports, for many that might change. And so a kind of a project that we have underway is to think through from undocumented to people who are green card holders and might be just one step away from citizenship, what can we as a city do to support them in their path along this immigration continuum, especially as the federal structure remains broken. And then finally, I think one of the things that's exciting about doing this job in the de Blasio administration is that the kind of third big goal we have is to be advocates. So how do we use the platform of New York City, how do we use the platform of Mayor de Blasio as a national figure, not just a kind of local leader, to advocate for immigration reform, to advocate at the state level for things like the DREAM Act? What's our responsibility to talk about the importance of pro-immigrant policies and show that in New York we're doing a lot of great things and the sky isn't falling? Quite the contrary, things seem to be moving on quite well because we're friendly and open to immigrant communities. So those are sort of the big pictures or tent poles of how we're thinking about our work.
Maybe we can talk a little about municipal ID, because I find that really interesting and a really possibly very progressive and useful policy. So maybe could you talk a little bit about the size and scale of this program as it would compare to other places in the country? And then maybe about how you would handle some of the immediate questions that would come up, like security and what kind of IDs would be used to get this ID and how useful it would be, and what the problems might be with fraud. We just, in the Democratic primary, elected a lieutenant governor candidate who was kind of notorious in her upstate district where she was county clerk for saying that she opposed driver's licenses for the undocumented because Hezbollah was right over the border in Toronto, which I don't find too plausible, but there are concerns about people giving a very useful government-issued ID to people who are here without authorization. So talk about that.
Sure. So New York's not the first jurisdiction to think about doing these municipal IDs. San Francisco has one, Oakland has one. And in those cities, just to give you a sense of scale, about 1% of the people signed up for municipal IDs. In New York City, even if only 1% signed up for municipal ID, it's still 80,000 plus individuals. We're hoping to actually have significantly more uptake. The way we're going to do that is we're going to actually have the ability for people, we're going to work through the libraries and some other kind of key city agencies to enable people to actually in their community sign up for a municipal ID card program. It could show a range of different, you have to prove who you are, right, that I am Nisha Agarwal, and you have to also prove that you're a resident of New York City, because we definitely don't want people from New Jersey or Connecticut to get these cards. And that's kind of it, right? And there will be, we'll do a kind of a process to sort of verify these documents that people are submitting, so the information is kind of sent to a back office and then verified, and then you get your card in the mail 2 weeks later. And so some of the protocols around, mailing the card to people to ensure that they actually live where they say they live, those kinds of things are meant to be the kinds of security features, kind of light touch security features to make sure that there isn't rampant fraud. There's no reason to believe there will be rampant fraud, right? We haven't heard of concerns in other jurisdictions, but we also are in New York City, so we want to at least put enough security features in place to ensure that there aren't problems associated with that. So I think we've been balancing the need to create wide access with also creating a secure card, and for what it's worth, the NYPD has sort of signed off on our card in terms of security to the point where they will be accepting the ID card for the purpose of issuing summons for people in lieu of arrest, which for those who haven't had ID is a really big deal. If you cannot get arrested and just get a summons, that's for immigrants certainly a very big win. And we're continuing to talk to financial institutions and others to convince them that our ID card is the best in the country.
Yeah, tell me about the financial thing. So is it possible that you could use this card and use it for banking the way you might use an ATM card, or just as an ID to open an account. How does that work?
So, learning a little bit from Oakland and some other jurisdictions, we didn't include a kind of prepaid banking feature into this card because the products that are out there have high fees associated with them. They're not necessarily consumer friendly. That could change in the future. But what we are advocating for is for the ID card to be usable for primary ID to open a bank account. And there's some complications with federal regulators. Will they accept it? The banks are not surprisingly a little risk averse, but we feel confident that we'll be able to get at least some institutions and certainly several credit unions to accept the ID card for primary ID.
Will it have like a photo or a signature or some biometric thing on it?
Yep. So they'll actually be, it'll be similar to the state driver's license where there's like the big photo and then there's like a little photo, which apparently adds security. I don't totally understand why, but it does. And sort of other kinds of things, holograms, infrared, the range of different things. It'll look very official. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is that we did focus groups with lots of different sort of populations in New York City, including the undocumented. And they said, make this as official an ID card as you can. In New Haven, they called it the Elm City ID card. And a lot of people were put off by that because they said, it doesn't feel like it's an official government ID. And so what you'll see when the cards come out in January is something that looks like kind of a proper bureaucratic government ID that's packed with a lot of benefits your driver's license doesn't have.
So it's not like a supermarket discount card?
No.
Although you will have some discounts and all kinds of enticing features for citizens to get in the program. That's great. I had the very good fortune of a couple of weeks ago of meeting Judge Katzman for the first time. He was launching this program, which you were involved in at the outset, called the Immigrant Justice Corps, which I found very fascinating and inspiring. I mean, I gave you a whole litany of terrible, terrible immigration news at the outset, but this is good news, and it's an effort, foundation funded, to create a corps of young lawyers and students to work and to give legal help to people who need it, to immigrants and poor immigrants. Could you talk a little bit about the lack of access to legal help and why it's so urgent to work on that, even in a city as supposedly immigrant-friendly as New York?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, Judge Katzman had, a couple of years ago, convened a sort of blue ribbon panel, one of the few studies of both the lack of access to counsel and why it makes a difference. And to give you a sense of some of the stats, right, if you are an undocumented person facing deportation and you have a lawyer, your chances of sort of successfully defending your case is actually 3 out of 4. If you do not have a lawyer and you're in the same situation, your chances of success are 3%. So that's virtually zero. So in terms of the importance of counsel and being able to both keep people out of detention as well as be able to sort of effectively make their case, a lawyer is critical. And the Immigrant Justice Corps sort of is one of the initiatives that came out of this study to really expand access to legal counsel. And this is going to become a critical issue if there is executive action, right, in a city where there's estimated to be 500,000 people who are undocumented. If some huge fraction of those individuals are eligible for the executive action, we'll still need to think about how do we properly sort of connect people to the services they need so they're also not being cheated out of lots of money by notarios and other kind of unscrupulous characters who try to take advantage of people's desperation to get good legal information.
It's kind of a weird situation where a good action on immigration, basically in a legalization program, will create more problems in the immediate future than less, because you have a huge population of people who will then have to navigate the system, apply, find the money for fees, and find representation in case something goes wrong. And that takes money, and that takes knowledge and access, so that would help a lot. The other question I had was, I find in writing about immigration nationwide that there's sort of an increasing tension as these states and cities try to become more humane or rational in dealing with immigration, particularly immigration enforcement, that there's like points of collision and conflict with the federal government and with ICE agents who are, working in our cities and doing what they've been told to do and basically continuing this deportation machinery, because that isn't stopping. Immigration reform has stopped, but the process of detaining and picking people up and sending them home or out of the country continues apace. And so more and more localities nationwide have come up with policies where they've said we're not going to cooperate with ICE if ICE wants to pick someone up without charge other than an immigration violation. We're not going to, you can do what you can't, do what you want to, but we're not going to use our cops, our sheriff's deputies, our police officers to help you in that immigration thing. It's sort of the anti-Arizona approach. Can you talk a little bit about what possible tensions or conflicts there might be between New York City and the feds on immigration, and what the city might be doing to counter that?
Sure, and I'll actually start a little broader than that, which is some context on this, right? This local cooperation with ICE is of relatively recent vintage, right? So the idea that local law enforcement should hold people on behalf of federal immigration, really a kind of immediate post 9/11 phenomenon. The kind of evil genius behind the idea is Chris Kobach, the guy who also helped draft the anti-immigrant law in Arizona. And the notion was that states and localities can be force multipliers for federal immigration agents to enable, they don't have the resources to deport all 11 million people, so they're going to basically leverage the infrastructure that we have at the local level to help do that. And the way it works is somebody gets arrested, it could be for a minor violation, and then their fingerprints are shared with the FBI, which just happens as a matter of course, but then also with immigration. And if there's some reason that ICE believes that this person's not in the country lawfully, they can tell local law enforcement to detain the individual for up to 48 hours. Now, this was sort of happening in broad strokes to everyone up until a few years ago, and then there's been sort of a series of iterative changes in the law to limit the extent to which New York City actually turns people over to ICE in these situations. Mayor de Blasio has had in his platform from the beginning the desire to significantly reduce the number of situations in which we would turn folks over to ICE, and it's something we've been discussing actively with the City Council and with advocates, and so we hope to kind of sever the tie to a large extent with federal law enforcement, because this is not, immigrants are not criminals, but I think when we sort of fuse the immigration system with the criminal justice system, it creates the kind of that narrative that immigrants are criminals and vice versa.
I'm not sure what point I should open it up to Q&A because I don't want to hog the mic, but I'm happy to turn it over to you guys because I'm sure that would be far more useful than me going on. Do you want to do that?
Sure.
Okay. Do you want?
I am a teacher of English as a second.
I'm sorry?
We would wait till the microphone gets to you.
Oh.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
My colleague and I are teachers of English as a second language for the New York City Department of Education, Office of Adult and Continuing Education. We want you to know about an affront to immigrants, human rights, and a sea change in their access to education, which has just happened. We have been told by our superintendent not to admit immigrants who do not know how to read and write in their native languages. This is a departure from the admissions policy, of open door policy to all, that has been in effect for over 40 years. And what we were told is to refer the students who cannot read and write in their native languages to the public libraries. However, Mr. Downs, your newspaper, the New York Times, in early August did a piece about how the New York Public Library cannot possibly accommodate all of the people seeking English classes, English language classes at that library system. The Queens library system, for years, and many sites has had a lottery system. The Brooklyn Public Library also is overburdened and overloaded. We have always worked peacefully and harmoniously in conjunction with these other agencies. Now we are being told to turn away students from our doors and send them there where they will also be turned away. In other words, we're sending them home and saying no school for you. A group of teachers have formed an ad hoc committee for educational equity to try to look into this, to bring public attention to it. We've been told by our city superintendent that it's a state policy, but we have called the state and they have said, no, it is not our policy, it was a local option. There is no rationale given to us for this other than something about the library's funding, which actually we have researched and doesn't make sense. We have always been funded to serve these students. We are the largest provider of adult education in the state. We have room in our classes. There is no reason to turn these people away other than what might be a cynical desire to raise our test scores because there's a perception that non-literate students lower our test scores, which is actually not borne out in the data.
So,
they did well, actually. Yes.
So is there a question, or should we maybe talk afterward about how best to handle this?
Well, it's more of an opportunity to draw
to register the problem.
But certainly, I would like to ask. I would like to ask you for your reaction to the information I presented.
Sure. So this is the first tonight that I'm learning about this, but happy to follow up on it to find out more on this specific instance. I also think it's an opportunity to sort of talk about the diversity of the immigrant population in New York in the sense that, we have a huge percentage of people who are limited English proficient in New York City. It's about 25% of the immigrant population is limited English proficient, which means they don't speak English well or read English well enough to sort of participate in certainly like filing for health benefits or doing a range of different tasks that people should be able to do and want to be able to do. So one of the things that my office is charged with and really responsible for is eliminating that language barrier. And there's a couple of different ways to look at that. One is ensuring that city agencies are doing what they should be doing, which is providing interpretation, translation, and sort of other services to support people as they're learning English to be able to navigate our very complex systems. And then similarly, sort of thinking about how do we support English language programs for people. There is a gross shortage of these programs, both for people who are sort of trying to seek work, but also those who might not be seeking work but want to develop their English skills for other reasons. So it's very much kind of on our radar screen, and we're trying to think creatively both about how to expand some of those services, but also my office had previously done a project called We Are New York, which was a sort of TV-based sort of amazing language acquisition. So we're thinking, do we want to do the next generation of that if we can raise the money to do it? So something near and dear to my heart, the first work I started doing was on language issues.
It is one of the great ironies of the immigration debate where the nativists who are highly irritated at the fact that people don't speak English are not necessarily in favor of
Can I tell a funny story associated with that? So when I was in my advocate days, which was most of my career before joining city government, we were advocating for a state law on language access in pharmacies, right? People can't understand what's on their medication label. It could be disastrous. So we were lobbying. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, which is not a bastion of progressivism. It's changing. But we were meeting with the finance chair who represents Syracuse, and he was quite shockingly rude to me and to the clients who were in the room. And at some point, sort of started railing about people, like people should just learn to speak English, and he kind of went on this long rant about that. And so I just sort of said to him, I'm like, that's great, we'd love to work with you on increased financing for English language classes, and he just sort of stared at me like blank-faced, because that was not the thing he was ready to commit to either.
It's supposed to happen magically. Once you get through JFK, legally, it happens like that. Who else? You can have mine.
I'm just curious as to the process of the ID process, how much it actually costs to get an ID, and what that's going to look like, and when will that information be released?
Sure. So the card will be free for the first year, and that also means that people should not be going to Roosevelt Avenue and paying lots of money to get a fake municipal ID card. So the card will be free, and the process we're in right now, we're doing the rules for how the card program will be structured, and there'll be a public hearing in October where folks can weigh in on their ideas about all of these different types of things, and then it'll be very public. We're going to start the outreach campaign a little bit in the fall, but really in full force in January when the card launches, and that's when it'll be available to everyone.
You mentioned filing for health benefits, and I'm wondering how much work your office has done on that. There have been some real improvements on the New York State Health site. in most cases, people are expected to supply a social security number. But there is now a path indicating that people who do not have a social security number because of immigration reasons, a whole set of whole procedure for them to qualify in certain cases. But there are still some bugs, like they were asking for an I-94 number, the entry card for people who are entering the country, which does not seem to be a requirement, but they asked for it, and well, I discovered if you make it up, you can still put 00000. They may be able to apply it and work it out down the road. So I'm just wondering about this, and also I do know that people who are applying for asylum are eligible for Medicaid in most circumstances while their application is pending. I'm just wondering about special immigrant juveniles.
So in general, on immigrant health, one of the things that's come together at City Hall is an immigrant health task force, which includes both city agencies, and we're a part of it, as is the Health and Hospitals Corporation, Department of Health, and advocates and sort of providers as well. So it's sort of both internal to city and external to city. And we're looking at exactly these questions, right? A lot of health issues are regulated by the state, and the city doesn't have a lot of policy-making power or regulatory power, as much as I personally think I would like to have for the city, but there could be other things that we do, either using our kind of advocacy platform or otherwise the fact that we are New York City, right? So there's things... I know there's been some really interesting conversations that are happening around whether it's possible to create an insurance product for those who aren't eligible for other sorts of insurance, right? And that's mainly the undocumented. Some interesting research, I think, will be coming out soon on that. Whether there's the sort of political momentum to do something at the state level or not is a question. I think there's also a lot that the city can do. There are existing laws, for example, around discounted care, something that passed in 2007 called Manny's Law, that provides deeply discounted healthcare at both private and public hospitals that nobody knows about, and it's available to you regardless of immigration status. And I think there could be a lot more work that we do to advocate, especially with some of the more elite private institutions, to make people feel like those doors, immigrants especially, those doors are open to them as well. So I think there's a few different kind of areas in which the city could make an impact, but we'd also love to hear ideas from all of you about what's the most useful thing. Is it more outreach and education? Can we do a better job of reaching people to let them know that they're eligible for certain benefits that they may not realize they're eligible for? I mean, I think those are the types of things that we best learn from folks that are on the front lines kind of doing this work, so that we can then put it into whatever kind of planning we're doing as well.
Hi, Commissioner.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your work, and for making New York City a much friendlier place for immigrants. I love the idea of the municipal ID program, and that we'll be able to even get cultural discounts. So that's a great thing. When the program was first proposed, there were some criticisms from the ACLU and others, and I was just wondering how you've addressed those concerns.
Yep. So the ID card, the concerns were mainly around privacy for individual card holders, and we feel very confident that there's little cause for concern really on the privacy front. And one of the things that will be discussed during the rulemaking process in detail are what are the different things the city can do to protect people if they've submitted documents as part of the application, and ensure that the city and the Human Resources Administration, HRA, is the agency that's sort of the one that's going to do all the implementation of the ID card program, right? People who apply for benefits at HRA are submitting all sorts of personal documents and kind of other things to the agency, as are other agencies kind of receiving that sort of information. And so we have really excellent systems in place, both to protect the data from a technology perspective, but also to protect it from other law enforcement agencies and others who may be interested in that data. And we have absolutely no reason to believe that personally identifiable information that people are providing to the municipal ID card program would have to be turned over in any way. So, I feel very confident, and I care deeply that there aren't sort of breaks in the security for the municipal ID card program. It's something that's sort of top of mind for us. So we don't know that the concern is a real live one, but we understand that it's out there, and one of the things as we're doing outreach to communities, we'll be very clear about the kind of protections and the really use kind of community leaders to also message to people that this is something that you shouldn't be afraid of, that it's a safe program to access.
And while that's a legitimate concern, I mean, one thing that has come up in that specific discussion is that, living here without papers is inherently risky, and people know the risks and would like the refuge of an ID, something to be able to protect them in an encounter with cops, and the balance, they weigh the balance rationally, and this with protections would be something that would be worth doing.
And I would say, going to kind of the way in which Lawrence opened this discussion, right, part of the brokenness of our federal immigration system is that risk kind of remains, even as localities try to do really progressive things to make people feel more secure. So, DACA was mentioned, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. In that program, we're asking undocumented young people to step forward and tell the federal government that I'm here unlawfully but should receive this DACA benefit. Our approach as a community that cares about immigrants can't be to not encourage people to take advantage of these benefits. It's about balancing the kind of very unfortunate risk that's maintained as Congress fails to act on immigration reform, and at the same time making life more bearable for people. And I think that's the challenge here. And I wish I could change so much about the current immigration system. That's where you take the risk away, and that's where you give people real security.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Commissioner Agarwal for the amazing changes that already have been made by your office, and for the attention to smaller immigrant communities in particular. In this regard, most immigrants that do come from Central Latin America are documented. Maybe partly because they just they can't come from their country just by crossing land border. They have to be documented. Nevertheless, they are facing their own very serious problems, and they have been left out almost completely out of the immigration reform debate, which maybe, I surmise, might be part of the reason why the immigration reform has had such a small, weak base as a result. But some of the problems that I want to ask you to address is the discrimination against immigrant professionals. In my community, Russian-speaking immigrants from former Soviet Union, this is a very acute problem. Particularly for people who have advanced degrees, including people who have American advanced degrees, including people with Ivy League degrees, very often spend years and years and years being told that they are qualified for this and for that, and kept outside of any employment opportunities, outside of business partnerships in many key areas of our economy. And the second related thing is a huge inequality in access to community funding for non-profit community projects across different communities. There are some that are paid a lot of attention, and others, like the Russian speakers, who are the third largest of 200,000 people in the city, have very big difficulty and almost have no community organizations funded by any major foundations that support other immigrant organizations. As a result, we have lots of folks who come here to this country. Particularly recently, we have a growth of immigrants from former Soviet countries in Manhattan. And many of those people, interestingly, have spent years struggling for civil and human rights and for social justice in their country. They come here, they have neither the opportunity to fulfill themselves in some role, nor even the infrastructure in the community to serve their immediate needs. What can your office do in those two things to reduce the inequality that our folks are facing?
Sure, so thanks for that. On the first question, of immigrants who may have advanced degrees and still face barriers in employment, one of the things that's happened is we really like task forces in this administration. So we have a Jobs for New Yorkers task force that's focused on basically dismantling the existing workforce system and then trying to build up something that works better. And what my goal has been as a participant in that task force is to elevate the kind of needs of immigrant communities in that context, including immigrants with advanced degrees who have difficult time sort of transferring their credentials from their home country to here, who have difficult time breaking into some of those the professions in which they've been trained because they happen to immigrate. So, we have there's some great organizations working in the field on this who've sort of provided excellent sort of suggestions in terms of policy changes that could come. We have examples. Michigan, for example, is sort of built into their workforce system a training program and sort of assistance program for immigrants to like help them navigate some of the career opportunities. So I think we can learn from other jurisdictions and build some of that into New York City's workforce program, and that's what Moya is trying to do through our workforce system. On the second question remind me your second question. Oh, yes, of course. So you won't be surprised to know that in the many meetings that I've had with immigrant community-based organizations since starting, this is one of the top things that comes up through city contracting, for example. Smaller immigrant community-based organizations are less competitive in trying to get government grants because they're small, they might not have a grant writer, all of those types of things. So we've actually started a conversation with the Mayor's Office of Contracting Services and some of the kind of internal city agencies that manage some of these things to see, are there ways that we could even change the procurement rules to give a little bit of a boost to groups that have the linguistic or cultural competency? What's possible? It's a area that's very new to me, and we're sort of learning as we go, but I think the immigrant CBO ecology in New York City is so rich, and what we need to do is find ways to be able to support those groups to grow and to continue to serve the communities that they serve. So it's both are ongoing projects, but they're on the radar screen. Yes.
Hi. You said a third of the population are immigrants. That's not including undocumented, right?
That is including the undocumented.
You have data on the amount of undocumented immigrants in New York City?
So yes and no. It's based on sort of estimates that are done using census data and other data that are available. In I guess it's sort of complicated how to come to that, but the kind of current estimates are approximately 500,000 of the,
okay.
yeah.
So there's like that's not including this, there's like 8.6 million people in New York City, right?
Right, and there's over 3 million immigrants, and then 500,000 of those are undocumented.
From basic, just real briefly, two more questions. Where are they from generally? And where would I access more of the resources? And one more question, from where do they come? When they're illegal, I know in Mexico they cross the border. Where do they come here? From the ocean, the beach? Where? I've always been curious about that. So.
Yep. So there's lots of ways that folks can actually become undocumented. One common way, for example, is that you did have a tourist visa or a student visa and you overstayed your visa. So you didn't swim, but you did land here somehow. And so those are sort of examples. And I'm sorry, I forgot the question immediately before that.
I think I asked from where generally. Like
right. So, I don't know that I could speak to kind of the general immigrant population in New York City, partly because of the way in which data is estimated around the undocumented. It's hard to give specific characteristics around the undocumented population, but New York City has one of the most diverse immigrant populations. So, the top immigrant group are Dominicans, but then Russians and the Chinese, and there's a number. It's a very mixed immigrant community, which makes my job really great, but also I think it makes New York unique in many ways in terms of the languages and the diversity of the folks that are here.
Can I sneak in a question that occurred to me when listening to you and to the question on Russians? Given the diversity in the city, how do you handle in your job issues of equity when some immigrant groups are more loud and more vocal and they're squeakier wheels and have more representation in the organization? How do you make sure that the Okinawans don't get the short end? I mean, you're having to be fair to everybody, but you also have to deal with large populations? How do you do that?
Right. So I think one thing is that you have to be proactive. You can't only be waiting to hear from people and think that that represents the cross-section of New York City. So actually, next week, we're launching what we're calling a sort of immigrant community listening tour, and we're going into different neighborhoods and meeting with people and asking them sort of, what are the challenges that you faced in interacting with city government? What are your goals? What are your aspirations? On the sort of understanding that not all immigrants aren't a monolith, and not the same issues are of concern to all immigrant communities. Now, even within that, right, there's this question of like, well, are you going to go to every single group that's out there? No, but I think we're trying to get a sense of kind of our own sense of, based on the data and other things, kind of a cross-section of New York City's immigrant communities. So my schedule is about to blow up, but I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Kevin O'Neill. I have in your initial agenda was very much about justice issues, which are critically important. I'd be interested in hearing about what's top of your agenda in terms of economic issues for immigrants. And similarly, is there an issue that you'd like to grapple with that you haven't seen a way forward or the momentum on yet, but would love to push it at the top of the agenda? Thanks.
Really good questions. So I actually think what we were just talking about in terms of immigrant workers is a real priority. And part of it is because there's a little bit of a gap at the local level in terms of what the city can do in terms of just enforcing basic rights around work quality and work adherence that employers have to different laws and things like that. And yet, after the funding for immigrant community-based organizations, immigrant worker issues like that are really kind of jump out in terms of what are priorities for folks in the community. And so I'm sort of struggling to figure out what's the role of the city in that and sort of immigrant workers. And there's incredible organizing and mobilization happening with different sectors of the immigrant worker community that I think are really inspiring and incredible. And so I think that's something that we're sort of starting to think about. And some of it plays out through the workforce, but there could be other strategies that we could use. And I think we'd have a lot of partners in that process if we can kind of figure it out. So I think on economic justice issues, that would be a priority. And then I think the health stuff, both because it's personally something I'm deeply passionate about, but also it's just hard. And it was during the healthcare reform debates, immigrants were the poison pill. And during the immigration reform debates, healthcare is too expensive. And that just keeps falling through the cracks. And between healthcare and kind of workers' rights issues, those are like key economic equality concerns that immigrants are sort of always being left out of. And so figuring out what we as a city can do on that, I think, is something we're grappling with.
So you said that Dominicans are the largest immigrant population in New York City, or unauthorized immigrant population?
Immigrant population. Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the deportations for New York City, Chinese immigrants make up over 20% and Dominicans only 3%. So how do you kind of balance either the size of the Dominican population with the size of the population of Chinese immigrants that are being deported and see, okay, this community is being underserved. Maybe it's bigger, maybe we're not estimating these populations appropriately. Kind of, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's actually a stat I had not heard before. It's definitely something worth kind of thinking about. Or is it? Are there kind of more legal needs, for example, in the Chinese community in terms of deportation defense, things like that? I'd want to actually look at the data a little bit more to be able to respond to that question in a meaningful way. But I think that just raises the question of sort of New York City's immigrant communities are so varied, and so when we think about kind of solutions for things, how do we ensure that we're designing solutions that are fit to the kind of populations and how they're being differentially affected?
Were those percentages or raw numbers, and where did you get those figures from?
So I got it's the deportations from the country for the past 10 years. I actually got it from somebody at the New York Times.
Okay, then it must be true.
And then I just looked at the Border Patrol offices in
I see.
New York City.
That's really interesting, because I didn't know that.
And I used it to make estimates of the unauthorized immigrant population by census tract by country of origin, if you're interested.
Wow.
I just want to know if the city have any budget or programs for developing or support cultural outreach to this community of immigrants and the commented. And as well as, I would like to know if there is any access to your data on this issue, on the immigrant population.
Yep. So on the first question, in terms of cultural outreach, I like all of my colleagues in city government, but one of my favorites is the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, Tom Finkelpearl, because he used to run the Queens Museum and made it, I think, the most immigrant-friendly museum or cultural institution in the country. And so now he's running the city's Department of Cultural Affairs and is actually sort of working on an immigrant cultural initiative that we've been working with them on to really think through this question of sort of cultural outreach to immigrant communities. And then in thinking about the municipal ID program, how do we build culture into that as a strategy for explaining something that could get really wonky and sort of bureaucratic very quickly, but could have cultural elements that make it more accessible to immigrant communities. So I think that's where we're focused in terms of culture, but then also working with Tom and his team at Cultural Affairs to really think about immigrants and culture and outreach around that. And then on data, I think I would suggest to all of you who are interested in data to go to the Department of City Planning's newest New Yorkers report, which came out last year. It's pretty much the best analysis of New York City's immigrant communities that, I think we're one of the few cities that has a demography unit, and they've done amazing work on data about the city and immigrants. And so I would check that out and download it when you get home.
Hi, Commissioner. I was hoping you could tell us more about what Moya is doing to encourage more civic participation by immigrant communities, please. Thank you.
Sure, and can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by civic participation that I can tailor that?
Well, more including themselves in the communities, like, for example, attending PTAs and such. Thanks.
Yep. So one of the things we're thinking about doing, we haven't yet done it, is actually we're partnering with New York City Service, which is the kind of volunteer recruitment core for the city, to focus exactly on these issues, right? Both how do we encourage volunteerism and civic participation among immigrant communities. Bilingual people are apparently one of the most sort of eager and prone to volunteer for things. So that, once I found that out, we thought let's do some targeted outreach to bilingual immigrant communities to encourage them to volunteer for different types of activities that we might be involved in. And then similarly, sort of thinking about other kinds of leadership development opportunities, we're going to be doing a project soon focused on immigrant women and girls and leadership with immigrant women and girls. One of the things I've noticed is that in some of the communities that I meet with, I'm usually the only woman in the room. And so I'm sort of wondering what's happening, where are the women leaders, and how can we, as city government, even start to think about engaging immigrant women leaders and kind of breaking down the barrier also between city government. We have amazing women in leadership in city government now. Can we build bridges between them? What can we do to kind of encourage women's leadership moving forward as well in the immigrant community?
Hello. I recently moved here from Utica, New York, which is about an hour east of Syracuse. And there I worked for the Refugee Center. And although we try to be welcoming, there are some serious access to education issues there as well. Currently, the high school is not allowing anyone 17 years or older to become enrolled. And so this is a serious issue we've known about. We've tried to work with the school district for several years, but it's gotten to the point now where we're not sure how to pursue this. I'm curious to know, one, if you know what New York City's Department of Education policy is on that, and secondly, if you have any advice for those of us trying to advocate for these students. Thank you.
Sure. So that's surprising. The lawyer in me is like, is that a lawsuit? That's possible. So New York City's DOE is incredible about sort of anybody who wants to enroll can enroll. The most recent experience we've had with that is on the unaccompanied minors issue, where I know in some parts of the country they've been throwing up barriers for kids to enroll in school. Not our city's DOE. They're sort of very enthusiastic about finding ways to encourage children of all ages to be able to enroll in school. Honestly, I don't know if I have advice on the school district issue, except that I come from the sort of school of thought where I think organizing and getting a group of people together to start speaking up, use the media to be able to elevate this issue. It seems like that's what I would have done when I was an advocate. Sort of think about.
What's the thinking? You age out of your constitutional right to a public education if you're 18 or over? Is that their logic, or?
No,
I'm sorry.
It's a misguided
project. The local school district, together with the local BOCES, believes that they fail to have an ability to benefit, which actually is for college, it's not for high school. They actually misunderstand the education law completely, but because they don't put it in writing, they actually tell our caseworkers, they had told our caseworkers on the phone to not send paperwork for individuals who come when they're 17. Last year, they were actually told to reduce that down to 16. Some of them are people who, individuals who have the right to education and could actually fulfill the requirements, but they believe that they can't. They're worried about test scores and funding issues, and they use the immigrants and the refugees as sort of their scapegoats.
So maybe we can talk after the program. I have suggestions of people you could talk to.
Thank you. But as far as we know, the law says they have a right to an education until 21. They have a right to get a
21.
diploma. But now they've developed these pathways, they call them, which means out of the regular system and into these off system.
Utica is otherwise a very bright spot in the immigration story, isn't it? As one of the cities that's very welcoming.
Yes,
this is the very nice piece, yeah.
From Susan Hartman.
Right.
And I met with her when she came to Utica. So it's been a fabulous city of welcome, but there's still a lot more work there to be done to welcome immigrants in a more appropriate way, because it is, outside of New York City, it has the highest concentration of foreign-born individuals in all of upstate New York.
Oh. What industry?
With the municipal ID, do you envision that that would be beneficial to people if they travel outside of New York? And what's happening in San Francisco? For example, somebody needs to take a domestic flight or come in contact with the criminal justice system in another state.
So unfortunately, we can't influence TSA, federal rules, or even the state in terms of enabling people to get on a plane to use this ID card or sort of change those laws. So this is only a card that really would be, I think, most valuable within the boundaries of New York City, and certainly would not run afoul of federal or state rules around this. So I think we're going to have to do some education on what you can and cannot use the ID card for, so people don't make the mistake of trying to use it in the wrong situations. There's been a sort of really quite fantasy idea of like maybe the cities that all have municipal IDs could like have reciprocity amongst the cities and recognizing their municipal IDs. There's not a real conversation about that, but you could imagine, partly because of this broken system, that you have these kind of islands of efforts happening, and then maybe we can tie them together, but that's really kind of out there at the moment.
Hello. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Anna. I just graduated recently from the Museum Studies program. I come from the Georgian Republic. And coming from this, I have a lot of international friends here. And most of the time, as far as I know, students have only 1 year after completion of the program to search for the jobs. And sometimes that limits time for them, or sometimes it's too short of a time to find the job. And I was wondering if the idea that you're discussing about is something that might be helpful for international students to extend the time in search of a job after graduation.
So I wish it were the case, but I'm assuming that that's probably not something that the ID card could be used for, but it is an ID card if you otherwise have authorization to work in the country. You could use it to show identity for the purposes of jobs, right? So I think it does have that component to it, but again, if I were in charge in DC changing some of these laws, that wouldn't happen.
What all this does is just it underscores the ungainliness and unwieldiness of the lack of a federal solution, because that's basically where these problems are going to be solved seriously and permanently. And states and cities are left to themselves to cobble something together, and it's literally crazy quilt.
You had mentioned earlier the opportunity for the city to serve as like a model of effective strategies and policies. I'm curious, outside of like the media, are there many established networks or platforms for, say, you to communicate with your counterpart in Utica or Des Moines or something like that?
Yeah, so there's lots of Moyas sprouting up around the country. And so we've sort of talked about, I often talk to those folks in kind kind of a more ad hoc way, but it's not out of the question for the different sort of Moyas to talk regularly, because many of us are sort of facing some of the same issues, though sometimes very different contexts, right? New York City is very different from Nashville, which is very different from another city that might have a Moya. So I think that's one platform. I think there's a lot of other kind of ways in which we can spread the word, right? It's national conferences. There's all sorts of, partly because of the emerging role of cities, not just on immigration, but on a whole host of issues while the federal government fails to act on things. Lots of networks of city officials or city leaders that are now, Mayor de Blasio launched Cities of Opportunity, which is a number of different cities to talk about economic justice issues. So, I think those are also vehicles by which to kind of share and disseminate best practices and strategies, and we'll plan to take advantage of all of them.
I know you had spoken earlier about the municipal ID program. It has to be on this very local level to New York City residents, but still, I'm wondering also about undocumented immigrants in the tri-state area who commute into the city, who work one or maybe multiple jobs. If there's anything that can be done for undocumented who work in the city, or if your offices have done any outreach with New Jersey and Connecticut.
That's a great question. So I think, unfortunately, the ID card will be focused on residents of New York City. But in terms of outreach and building bridges in the tri-state area, it's not something we've done yet, but it's not out of the question to do that moving forward, and thinking about a kind of regional approach, again, right, to some of these issues. So would love to hear your thoughts on sort of specific things that we might be able to do. I did that in my former job, and I feel like there's a real, there's an importance in kind of thinking about the tri-state area and the fact that people are kind of moving in and out of the city every day for work.
So my question is a bit of a combo of the last two. My colleague and I, Tanya, work for the New York Immigration Coalition. It's a statewide coalition. To continue the upstate trend, I'm from Rochester. So,
so is she.
Rochester out there. Many times, and I think this is very much the difference between, I know there's a lot to do in New York City. Your mandate is not outside of New York City. But as was just said, the line is gray between city and state. And specifically in New York, I feel like there's so much that you and your office and what New York City is doing could be learned from in Rochester, in Syracuse, and Utica, particularly the cities that are not as progressive, that don't have Moyas, that have populations that are maybe here for immigration court, as we see with the UAMs, unaccompanied minors. The majority are outside of New York City, but they're in our courts. How can you affect that policy upstate, influence, talk, spread good policy?
So one could be by partnering with great groups like the New York Immigration Coalition to actually have, those conversations with sister cities, right? Like we would need the help of identifying who are the kind of key partners, whether it's in government or on the ground in terms of grassroots groups, to anybody who wants to talk to us. We were just talking to folks in San Diego, right, about wanting to create a mayor's office of immigrant affairs. So we'd be happy to kind of do any sort of support or thinking with folks around the state. And then I do think there's this element of advocacy, right, where we can take a stand on issues that are happening at the state level. We might not be able to change those laws ourselves, but we certainly are a big player on the scene in Albany as New York City. So I think also ideas on how we can do that and kind of lift up New York City as a model in a way that also, frankly, isn't off-putting to folks in other parts of the state who kind of always were like, oh yeah, New York, So I think we'd want to think about the strategy around that, but it's certainly something we'd be very eager to do.
Talking about all the work you have to do in the city, and then it expanded to the tri-state area. Now we would love to have you make all the decisions regarding immigration on the federal level as well, but I don't think that's what you got into. But I want to just end with a simple, a different, to kind of step out of things, realizing like you can only do so much, and that so much of what you have to do depends on the cooperation of other agencies, of people. And one thing I want to stress too is that immigration is not an issue that's just for immigrants. Immigration is an issue for people, whether they are the grandchildren of immigrants, the great-grandchildren of immigrants, and that's something we kind of work with a lot here. But one thing, in December, we had a party for Fatima Shama to celebrate her tenure. So in 8 years from now, because de Blasio will be assuming he's reelected, and you are able to kind of take a different tack and think about what you accomplished in the last 8 years. What would you want to say you did?
Gosh, that's such a good question. The hardest question of the night.
And it's open-ended, as all of our questions.
So my wish list. One would be the most successful, broadly based municipal ID card program in the country. That's without a doubt one of the things. The other thing I didn't mention that we're doing is sort of working with each agency to kind of have an immigrant inclusion action plan, right? So in 8 years, I'd love to see that just be a part of the routine of different city agencies that say, what are steps we can take? 2 or 3 things we can take to make our agency more immigrant friendly. And I think if we had that, if it was just part of the DNA of the city, I don't know how you measure that, but that would be a huge win. And the last, there's a number of different things. I think language access, I think is an area where we could do a lot better. We've made some real strides, but I think we could do a lot better, and it's hard. It's like getting in the blood and guts of an agency of how they actually provide these different services. So if in 8 years my colleagues who did language access advocacy with me said that they really see a difference on the ground in terms of people's ability to access services, I would feel really thrilled about that.
And that's so interesting too, because a lot of the visitors, we have about 210,000 visitors who come every year to the museum. A third are New Yorkers, a third are international tourists, and a third are people from outside the tri-state area. And most of them are very excited to talk about immigration issues and to connect past to present. But sometimes we get people who will say something to the effect of, immigrants don't learn English. My great-grandparents, they learned English, and then you're like, well, did you ever have a conversation with them? Did you talk about Proust? What was the English that they learned? So what we do often is we're able to show them our census records that show that in this building in 1900, only maybe 40% of the people did not know English, and those who did know English were the children who were able to go to the public schools, and there was so much English language learning, and we're able to also show them an advertisement in Yiddish for learn English quickly, night school in Yiddish. That's the same thing that you see on Zoni, on the subway thing. So there's so much of that, happening, that education that needs to happen around language, and it's exciting to kind of think about your energy and applying that to this huge, wonderful, exciting issue.
Can I add one more thing to my wish list? In 8 years, we better have immigration reform.
Yes.
And New York City better be like the best at implementing it. So that's
excellent.
The last.
So I want to thank Lawrence, and I want to thank Nisha for having this conversation. And I also really want to thank you. I think we've been doing Tenement Talks for, well before my time. It was started, I don't know, in 2004, and I haven't been at all of them. But I would say that this has been the Tenement Talk that has had the most participation from you. And we heard about education, we heard about health, we heard about work conditions, we heard about different immigrant communities throughout the city. So I want to thank you for your wonderful participation, and to urge and encourage you to keep this conversation alive here at the museum. Next week our topic is a little bit lighter, but it's the conversation with Lou DiPaolo, who runs DiPaolo's Fine Foods. He's coming out with a book. So there will be food for thought as well as food in reality. He's going to be, Leonard Lopate will be introducing him. And then October 8th is one I think you will really like. It's a conversation with Nancy Foner, Phil Kazinitz, and Margaret Chin, sociologists who study New York immigration today, right here. And we'll also be with our curatorial team talking about our new endeavors and how we are going to be shaping new exhibits. So we have a whole array of events, about 10 or 12 this season. We urge you to get a sheet that gives you this little card we have at the front that gives you the whole rundown. And I also want to thank Con Edison, who so kindly helped sponsor these talks, and I want to thank all the wonderful educators who are here tonight too. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.